At this point in the program, we had planned to have Unified Government Mayor Mark Holland introduce today's speaker. Unfortunately, he had an unexpected change in his plans. So it gets to be my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Peter Block, and welcome him back to the Kansas City area. Peter grew up here, graduating from Shawnee Mission High School, and also attended the University of Kansas, and now he makes Cincinnati his home. Peter is an internationally known author and expert on the restoration of community, but his work goes beyond the typical restoration we might think about, and that being the infrastructure and services. But instead, he focuses on the social capital necessary to create and sustain communities. And I think today some of the our awardees exemplify that social capital. He has been a frequent and popular instructor in MARC's Executive Leadership Program for local government administrators. And Peter will talk today a little bit about the shift that is occurring when we think about community and what he sees happening today. A citizen-based movement that has the power to change the world in all aspects of community living: housing, health, safety, and economic development. Citizens are caring for the commons, engaging and working together in powerful and effective ways. Peter's books on this topic include Community, the Structure of Belonging, and The Abundant Community. And we're eager to hear about his ideas and how they might work for us in the Kansas City region. Please join me in welcoming Peter Block.
Thank you. Thank you for the intro. Thanks for the meal. Surprisingly, it was chicken. I thought it was delicious, even though I didn't have it. So I like coming back here. I got out of school, I went to graduate school, I tried to find a job, and nobody would hire me. So I was doomed to go east for 35 years. But it's good to be in the Midwest. All the time I was in the East Coast, they said, "Where are you from?" And I lived there 40 years. I always say Kansas City. So that's a great homecoming. There was only one Shawnee Mission when I was here. Now it's called North. It was just Shawnee Mission. And I remember going to KU. They had to take me because I was above a C student and I lived here. And I thought I never left the area. So I remember getting my car all fixed up for this long trip, and 35 minutes later I was there. And I thought this much of a map must take hours. And I think this is a celebration. I think you created something here that's unique in the world. I think you created something here that goes against the dominant culture. And I'd like to kind of just share some thoughts about that. This is a testimony or a witnessing of cooperation in a culture that really is very different than that. And I think most of us are grieved in some way by the conversation that goes on in this world. The culture, it's a deep culture of individualism. It's been going on for hundreds of years here. The individual is king. Individual rights. All individual self-development. The individual, our housing is all castles, McMansions if you make it. And so in a deeply individualistic culture that values that above all else, you stand for something different than that. It's a culture of privatization. We've come to believe that only the private sector is competent. It's the myth of private superiority, I would call it. And so what we've done is outsourced many of the civic and public functions to the private sector. The private sector now is kind of claiming a kind of sovereignty over the land, over the air, over the water. In Cincinnati, we've outsourced a lot of our urban planning to the private sector. We have highways and toll roads that are now run by private sector. And they kind of dominate the thinking. And the assumption is, why can't everybody else be like the private sector? And it's not an argument against that, but you are testimony that that myth of superiority is a myth. That in some ways, it's time to honor public service. It's time to honor the common ground, the common good, which we've lost in this era of privatization. And so that's another thing I think you create an alternative to. We're a culture of speed. Everything has to be fast now. Everybody wants to send me something, FedEx, and they don't realize it stands on my desk untouched for days. Don't you realize I'm not interested? And the answer is, it doesn't matter, I'll FedEx this to you. And so everything has to be fast. Investments have to return something. And so it's a speed-dominated culture. What you're doing takes time. If you care for the common ground, if you care for cooperation, when she said at CASA, when we met Saturday after Saturday after Saturday, cooperation needs to work at nature's speed, which is medium and slow. And so the fact that there's so many different sectors of the world in this room tells me that you have some patience. The fact that MARC has been here for 40 years tells me you have some patience. That things that matter and care for the commons can't be done quickly. And what we call multitasking, in most cases, is a form of ADD. It's a form of not paying attention to anything. And the online world, the technological world, the promise that it makes. Now you can have professors giving courses with 170,000 students. And so the speed world loves leverage. It's called leveraging things. What they don't realize is 3% of the students stay with it for more than 2 sessions. And so you're an alternative to speed. Also, we live in a consumer society. A consumer society says that whatever you want can be purchased. And in some ways, we've outsourced most of what matters to us. If you talk about the commons, what does that mean? Well, it means to care for our children. And in my mind, kind of the point of this is that communities and social fabric has work to do. And it's the care for a child, and we've outsourced the care for our children to the schools. The reason we're disappointed in public schools is not because they're not doing a great job. It's not because teachers aren't committed. It's because we've laid things on them that families and neighborhoods used to do. It's not just they have to learn about history and civics and reading and science. Now they have to worry about their sexuality. We have to worry about their drug abuse. So in Cincinnati, we can't lock the lockers, so we can do surprise searches. And so I've asked the school to care about their health, to care about their feeding, to care about their well-being. We have behavioral and values. So all the things that families and neighborhoods once did, we've said, schools, you take that. And in some ways, I've done it in all the other categories of the commons. The common good is about my health, and I've outsourced my health to the medical profession. So I go to my doctor, and she says, how are you doing? I lie. I say, Dottie, it's your job to find out if I have a health problem. I don't want to take any personal responsibility for my health. I don't like exercise. I like fat grams, and carbohydrate is my middle name. Now, Dottie, do your job. And it's a better living through chemistry. This is what, so I've outsourced, even though 85% of the determinants of my health are somehow either my own history or in my own hands. If I am a socially engaged person like you all are, because you're here, it adds 1 year to my life just if I have a network of relationships. And so I've outsourced health. I'm disappointed in government. So all these areas are areas for reform. We want government reform, I want school reform, I want health care reform, the financial institutions. So a consumer society says whatever you want, you can purchase. And I have you as an alternative to that. That what you will stand for is that whatever we want, we can create together. And a consumer society says no matter how much you have, it's not enough. And so when we have a national disaster, the first thing from the president is go shopping. A consumer society is based on self-interest. We act as if self-interest was true. When they do research on economists and other liberal arts students, they find out the economists are the most depressed of any discipline people study. All right, the most cynical. And so we bought the notion that economy is all about self-interest. And the idea that if whatever I have is not enough, all right? Whatever I buy now is obsolete before I get to my car. So I just live in Best Buy, so everything I have is up to date, okay? And if what I have is not enough, then I bought the notion that who I am is not enough. And so we have huge development training industries. And so all these are messages. They're messages of consumption, an economy of self-interest. They say that whatever you care about, if it's the land, if it's our children, if it's my health, if it's my safety, I've outsourced to the police. And the reality is that these professionals do amazing work and they don't solve the problem. My safety is based on eyes on the street. My safety is based on the quality of a neighborhood, the well-being of my children. If you do the research on children, says if the people know their names, if you want a safe neighborhood for your children, it comes from people knowing the names of the child and people spending time outside their house. And so to me, that's what you're dealing with, that the dominant narrative, the dominant culture is there's something wrong with us. The dominant storyline every night on television, there's something wrong with Cincinnati. There's something wrong with Kansas City. And if you watch the first 13 minutes of every news broadcast, they're going to find something wrong with us. Somebody got killed, somebody got robbed, a fire took a house, and if it didn't happen in Cincinnati or Kansas City, it happened in St. Louis or Chicago. We'll show it to you. And so there's a curriculum in the dominant culture that says there's much to be afraid about. It's a scarcity mentality. And to me, this is kind of what the work is in community building, is to create an alternative to that, to say what we value. And the elected officials in the same bind. I mean, thank God somebody's still running for office. You know, anybody, I mean, there's no reason to get ideological. Anybody runs for office, you just got to love them. And because they're fools, all right? To put up with the crap that we give them, I think we should give all elected officials in this room a big round of applause. So for each of these functions, you say, well, community building, if the social fabric, most of what we know about safety and the child and my health, most of the land, the people on the margin, the violence comes from related to our connectedness to each other. It's the social fabric. Systems, in a way, the funding crisis gives us a message, even though you're honoring systems, that the systems have reached a limit. The idea that human care and human service can be systematized, we're kind of reached the limits of that. So something different is required. And here's some thoughts I have about what you're doing. You've decided that cooperation counts. You've gone against the conventional notion of self-interest, the invisible hand of the market. You've decided to cooperate with each other. Darwin, in his later years, realized that survival were those who cooperated the most, not those who competed the most. And so you're an embodiment of that. You're an embodiment of caring for the civic sector. You're an answer, and it's not an argument against the privatization, but just to say there's certain things in the commons that we have to care for together. You work at nature's pace. I don't have you as being a high-speed group, even though you have high-speed technology. And nature goes medium and slow are the two speeds of nature, which means that you have a stewardship instinct. It seems to me that the reason you're here is you care about the long run. You care about the well-being of the next generation, where most of the culture cares about this moment. So let me tell you kind of some shifts in thinking. For elected officials, we expect you to treat us like customers. All right, the consumer society says, I'm a customer of yours. Nordstrom's did that to us. Because it's a department store that sells clothes, and somebody brought a tire to them once and said, I want to return this tire. And they said, we don't sell tires. And the customer said, I don't care. I want my money back. And Nordstrom said, yes. And so at that moment, we were all doomed to a culture of entitlement and customer orientation. And elected officials are caught up in that, and the shift in thinking is to say, no, we need to restore people's citizenship, so to go from consumer to citizen. A citizen complains to elected official, a reasonable response is two reasonable responses. One is to say, what you're asking for, I have no idea how to provide you, all right? And they will say, that's not the kind of leadership I'm looking for, and your response should be, how do you think I feel about this fact, okay? And the other question is, how can we get citizens to care for themselves what they want somebody else to handle? And so you talk about neighborhood building, and I'm sure there's a lot of that happening here. And so elected official, you say, if I'm an elected official, let me think about these as citizens who are capable most of the time, if they cooperated, of solving the problems they have in their neighborhood. And you have all kinds of examples of that happening. You say social services, human services, which are a wonderful instinct. You say, how do we get human services to do capacity building in neighborhoods? How do we ask people to care for the people on the margin? There's enormous casualty in this consumer culture of people with loneliness, of people with disabilities, people with all. And what we're seeing now is from kind of services to circles of support in neighborhoods for these kind of people. We need to support the schools and take off their back the raising of my children. And say, well, let a neighborhood, so we're seeing places where people are going in neighborhoods, knocking on doors and doing a kind of asset and asking people, what do you love to do? So John McKnight's a friend and partner of mine. And we go to neighborhoods and say, what are you good at in neighborhoods, especially in poor neighborhoods? There's a church in Indianapolis. Mike Mather runs this church that stopped its food pantry. It stopped its GED training. It stopped its place, its home. And they say, we're going to knock on every door and ask each citizen, what do you love to do? What are you good at? And what they find out is that there's enormous gifts, even in the most distressed neighborhoods. They say, I know how to pray. I know how to be with the child. I know how to fish. I know how to repair a small engine. And so you start thinking, well, the school could be a gathering place for the gifts of the neighborhood to take on the care of our children that building can't handle. The whole notion of school reform being a problem with the teachers is just such a painful thought. And it's such a small version. It says if we had better teachers, we'd have better schools. And so all of these themes say, well, there's a cooperative movement, there's a neighborhood movement taking place in this country. And I think the context in which you show up here is a way of servicing that. There's things changing in the private sector. So we have social entrepreneurship. We have conscious capitalism as a movement. You have private companies realizing that profits is a secondary intention. So if you really talk about building community, you're thinking differently about the economy. And there's growing in this world an economics of generosity. There's something called time banking, where you actually get credit in a bank for acts of generosity. Then when you need something back, you work down your credits. A guy named Edgar Kahn has created that. And so I think the shift in thinking is elected officials treating people as citizens, services, saying what can we do to build neighborhood capacity. There's mini grants. I don't know if you're doing it here in Kansas City, but where you give $300 to a neighborhood and you say if 3 households come together to do something good for the neighborhood, we'll give you $300 to act on it. And so again, you're building and saying neighborhoods are the place that can take care of our children and keep us safe. It's a shift in thinking from a deficiency mindset to a gift mindset. So most of this culture is organized around deficiencies. If you want to raise money, you have to have something wrong with you. If I want to see a doctor, I have to have something wrong with me. My doctor does not like me because my file is too thin. And so we want to see deficiencies. The news talks about deficiencies. The journalistic instinct, all right? The fourth estate is all about what's wrong with us. And so you say, what's the shift? What's the transformation? Well, it's to say, what are the gifts and capacities of Kansas City? And that's part of what we hear in the conversation, you know, about these awards, and part of what David talks about. And so you start thinking, I want to start finding out what's right for us, what works for us. Where do we find journalism that talks about the possibilities of this city? Second shift in thinking is from like-mindedness to hospitality. This culture is deep into like-mindedness. Everywhere I go, I find people who think like I do. And people want to be around like-minded people, and everything. I might buy something online, They tell me what other people like myself are buying, and what irritates me is they're right. That's what bothers me, is I'm so susceptible to this world. And this culture is terrified of the stranger. We're building a 1,000-mile wall between us and Mexico. And I think we could have saved money if when the Berlin Wall came down, we could have just lifted it up and set it down on the Mexican border. And it's not about ideology, it's not about the argument, it's just to say that the world changes, this city blossoms in the context of welcoming the stranger. In the Bible, the Old Testament, widows, orphans, and immigrants were the people who were the most vulnerable. And so you start thinking, well, how do we bring strangers together? What you've done here that's successful for these projects that are awarded, for the existence of MARC, what you're doing is creating a culture of hospitality here. You're saying, I'm not showing up to argue. I didn't come here to find out how we're different. Most community meetings are people gathering together to celebrate their differences. And the news colludes with this. It says if you report on both extremes, it's called balanced reporting. Well, you can't report on two unbalanced points of view and call that balanced. And so part of the thinking is to say, why don't we, as a city, as a gathering, as an elected official, as a private sector, as a social service, whatever, you say we're here to bring strangers into the room together to talk about their common interest and what they have in common. And that's a whole different way of thinking. And then the third shift in thinking is about neighborhoods. And I know there's strong neighborhoods here. The globalization movement extracts us from our neighborhood. Most of the gifts and tasks that exist in the neighborhood we've extracted. We now think we can purchase it all. We've moved into the backyard. There's a movement called pocket neighborhoods that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that build small houses around the commons or go into an existing neighborhood and say, why don't we decide what we can do together? We can eat together, we can watch our children together. People move to the front of the house. So the neighborhood becomes the focus. It's also a shift in leadership. So this culture loves iconic, heroic frontiers leadership. Bill Gates, Jack Welch are our kind of iconic heroes. I love the fact, and I've been at these awards ceremonies before, and it's a wonderful way of acknowledging people who do special things. But every time somebody gets an award, what's the first thing they say? I don't deserve this, okay? I didn't do this on my own, and they begin to thank and I always think, you're right. But we're still kind of awarding individuals as heroic figures. Although you did have some couples here, I thought that was kind of nice. And so you say, well, leadership of this kind of role model, visionary, you say, let go of that. It doesn't serve community building. And so you talk about leadership going from hero to host. You also talk about changing the ways that we gather. Even in one of the images, you say, we involve citizens, all right? And I saw an image of citizens raising their hands and voting. It was a nice image. But they're all lined up in chairs. And so we still gather people lined up in chairs. As soon as you line people up in chairs like sardines, all right, it's nice that they came, have a seat. But what you're saying is that you didn't come here to be with each other, you came here to be with us. So auditoriums, people lined up in rows, tells everybody that other citizens came here and are turning their backs on you. And so you start thinking, how do we gather people in small groups and in circles so citizens find each other? What I need from my elected official is somebody that can get me together with other citizens in a conversation with citizens to talk about how I'm going to keep my neighborhood safe, how I'm going to handle whatever's bothering me at the moment. So the method of gathering shifts from kind of royal protocols to communal protocols. And the last thing I want to chat about is the narrative itself. That all transformation is linguistic. And what's happening in this city that I can feel this time, because I came and did my usual trip by Arthur Bryant's, which to me is the best cuisine in America. All right, I love that place. And I love the elegance and sophistication in which they serve the meal. Nobody says, my name is Charles and I'll be your server tonight. They say, you want pork or beef or turkey? And then they start throwing it on with their hands and find butcher paper large enough so it doesn't drip on the car. That, to me, is fine dining. But what's occurring here, then, is you're changing the story. Because the old story of Cincinnati is there's something wrong with us. Same with Kansas City. I moved to Cincinnati 13 years ago, and the first thing they said to me is, "What are you doing here?" You know, and this whole country is so coastal-centric. Nothing, there is no map on either coast that includes Kansas City or Cincinnati on that map. And so what you're doing is you're changing the narrative. You're changing the story of who we are. What's happening in Cincinnati also. The story from being a problem city to a possibility city. That's what I hear in this gathering. And it's not that it's a denial of problems. It's just say, if we're coming together, what do we talk about? What's possible here? Or what's wrong here? I know the discussion of what's wrong never heals a wound. Cincinnati has done a study of racism for the last 10 or 14 years. And guess what they discovered? That racism is a problem in Cincinnati. Now, the fact that the action plan is to study it the 8th time, the 9th time, you think, I'm sure there's another one underfoot now by some will. And so the discussion of problems does not create an alternative culture. What creates an alternative is say, what's possible here? The fact that you're no longer allowing the state line as needing a passport. It's a radical shift in narrative and conversation. And I hear that, and I think it's not accidental that all of you got awards were for cooperative acts. There's another conversation of blame versus ownership, that this culture loves to find out who did something wrong and what are we going to do about them. And so basically community building is say, who's doing something that's working and how can we take advantage of that? And so you start talking about people ownership. Also, what you're operating that I like about this gathering is it's not by mandate, it's by invitation. Everything I heard and everything you do is by invitation. So you get the people that want to be there. Where the dominant culture thinks you have to force people to be there. You have to mandate people to be there. And the last thing is the gifts and the gift orientation. That at some point we begin to realize that if we want to create an alternative future to the one that nationally is frozen, and to me that's a gift. I was thinking most of the time it's painful to see that we have elected officials, public servants, who are committed to an ideological, and it's a standstill. But maybe it's a gift because then it allows us to expect nothing from the federal, all right? Stay frozen, stay paralyzed if that's the way it is. Same thing with states. States now are having surpluses, and they took money away from local services because in the hard times, and now they're saying probably, and you're not going to get it back. And so one way to think about that is, okay, I know that locally within this region, anything we want, we're going to have to create on our own. And that will come specifically from talking about the gifts and capacities we have in this community. And it's a gift-mindedness. Now, some people think it's naive, and it's not Pollyanna. It's just that what you see is what you get. And if the communities start looking, and there are communities I work with in Cincinnati whose story of themselves is there's something wrong with us. Lincoln Heights is the oldest political unit in America that's a black community. And traditionally, if people talk about Lincoln Heights, they talk about what's wrong. Oh yes, we have the highest crime, we have the lowest education, we have the more poverty. So that's a story. You say, well, that story will change the moment you say, what are the gifts and capacities of Lincoln Heights? Same thing with the crime. Everywhere I go, cities compete for homicide rates. And so you go to Milwaukee, we got the worst damn homicide rate in something. I go to Cincinnati, our homicide rate. You go to Chicago the same way, Memphis. Everywhere I go, people almost take pride in homicides. I don't know if it's true here or not. You may not be in that competition. And you say, well, that tells me that the narrative they have for themselves is to focus on what's wrong with us. And so part of what this movement, and it is a movement, because every place you go there's a co-op movement, there's a co-housing movement, and you know that building a local economy. And so this movement is organized around a shift in narrative. Now we don't have journalism that's caught up with that. So we may have to create that, because most of our TV stations, most of the newspapers, basically if it leads If it bleeds, it leads. They take their pride. The tribal instinct is we're here to confront, create accountability, all that conversation. Luckily, it's not working, because everywhere I go, the newspapers are shrinking, and they're getting smaller. The Cincinnati Enquirer now, newspaper is about this big. All right, so if you're my age, you not only don't want to read it, but you can't read it. And so to me, you're part of a movement. And the movement is that cooperation, that a shift from an economy of self-interest to a place of generosity, that a shift from like-mindedness to the fact that we welcome strangers. We need strangers. All surprise comes from strangers. Whenever we gather people together in community meetings, we never let them sit with people that they came with, because you'll never be surprised from people who think they know you. And so you start thinking that way, and then to me, it's a huge shift, and that's what you are here for. That's the way I've experienced. That's why I showed up, because John and Carol have been good friends of mine for years. And I just want to just kind of honor and celebrate you for the radical. Now, you don't look like radicals. You look quite normal, well-dressed, okay, got ties and stuff, a little overweight, so all that tells me things are going well, okay? But what you're doing in this gathering and this kind of turnout and all the projects that David described means that you are radically shifting some basic tenets of this culture. And you're saying that cooperation, giving up interests, doing things out of generosity works and successful. And so I'm just happy to be here with you and support you in that. Anyway, thank you very much.